Tonight, we will explore the nature of harm. Not the harm that arrives like a storm, sudden and unexpected, but the quieter kind. The harm we weave with our own hands. The harm we tie into rope. The harm we press into scales. The harm we carve into stone and call it sacred. These are ancient teachings offered gently about the ways our actions ripple outward into the world, and then, as rivers return to the sea, find their way back to us. These stories come from a time when villages were small and trades were learned at the hands of elders, when a name meant something, when trust was the currency beneath all other currency. But the truths within these stories are timeless. They breathe in our world today just as they breathed then. If this path calls to you, if these teachings bring you comfort in the quiet hours, I invite you to subscribe and return whenever you need rest, whenever you need a story to carry you gently into sleep. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing to fix, no problem to solve, no one you need to become. You are simply here, resting, listening, allowing these words to move through you like warm water through sand. Some will stay, some will pass. Both are fine. Let your breath settle into its own rhythm. You do not need to control it. Simply notice the air as it enters, and notice the air as it leaves. Each breath a small letting go. Each exhale a release you did not know you were holding. Let us begin this journey together. There once lived a rope maker named Arjun in a town where 3 rivers met and trade moved through like blood through a heart. The town was not large, but it was vital. Caravans passed through carrying spices and cloth. Well diggers worked the surrounding plains, lowering themselves into the earth on ropes to find water for villages that had none. Fishermen along the riverbanks cast their nets with rope. Builders hoisted timber with rope. Ships were moored with rope. In this town, rope was not merely a product. It was the thread that held life together. Arjun had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of hands that knew the feel of fiber, the tension of a proper twist, the weight a good rope could bear. Arjun's fingers were rough and strong. His palms were calloused into permanent ridges that mapped the years of his labor. He could tell the quality of hemp by rolling a single strand between his thumb and forefinger. He could judge the strength of a finished rope by the sound it made when pulled taut, a deep, satisfying hum, like a string on an instrument tuned to the right note. He was skilled. This was not in question. His ropes were strong and his knots held true, and for many years his reputation was good. But across the market square, another rope maker had set up shop. A man named Vikram, younger than Arjun, with quick hands and a warm smile that drew customers the way a lantern draws moths in the evening. Vikram had arrived from a distant city with new techniques, new ways of braiding that produced rope that was lighter yet still strong. His prices were fair. His manner was generous. He gave small lengths of rope to children for their games. He offered discounts to well diggers who bought in quantity. And slowly, steadily, like water wearing a groove into stone, Vikram's business grew while Arjun's began to thin. Arjun noticed the change first in the mornings. Where once a small line of customers had formed outside his workshop before dawn, now he opened his doors to an empty street. He noticed it in the evenings, counting his coins and finding fewer each week. He noticed it in the way merchants nodded to Vikram in the market and passed Arjun without a word. Something began to grow in Arjun's chest. Not a sudden fire. Something slower. A coal that smoldered day after day, fed by every customer who walked past his shop and into Vikram's, fed by every laugh he heard from across the square. fed by every coil of rope he saw carried away by hands that once would have carried his. He told himself it was unfair. He told himself that Vikram used inferior materials and would soon be exposed. He told himself that loyalty should matter, that years of good work should count for something. And there was truth in some of these thoughts. Loyalty does matter. Years of good work should count. But truth, when mixed with bitterness, becomes something else entirely. It becomes justification. It becomes the story we tell ourselves to permit what we would otherwise never allow. One evening, sitting alone in his workshop, surrounded by coils of unsold rope, Arjun made a decision. It arrived not as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet settling, the way sediment settles to the bottom of a still pond. He would not compete with Vikram by making better rope. He would not lower his prices or learn new techniques. Instead, he would make Vikram's rope seem dangerous. His plan was simple and required only what he already possessed: skill with rope and access to the market. He would buy Vikram's rope through intermediaries, small boys he paid a few coins to make purchases on his behalf. Then, late at night in his workshop, he would carefully, methodically weaken the knots. Not obviously, not in ways that a casual inspection would reveal, but in ways that would cause the rope to fail under sustained stress. A fiber cut here, a twist loosened there, the core of a knot hollowed so that it looked solid but was not. Then he would sell this sabotaged rope at a discount, claiming it was Vikram's surplus, offering it to customers who worked far from the town where complaints would take weeks to travel back. He began this work on a night when rain fell steadily on the roof of his shop, and the sound of water masked the quiet scraping of his blade against fiber. His hands, those skilled hands that had spent a lifetime making rope strong, now worked with equal precision to make rope weak. There is something terrible in this, when skill is turned against its own purpose, when the hands that know how to create learn instead to destroy. He felt nothing as he worked, or rather, he told himself he felt nothing. But somewhere beneath the numbness, beneath the justification, beneath the careful story he had constructed about fairness and competition and his right to protect his livelihood, there was a tremor, a vibration, like a rope pulled too tight just before it snaps. He ignored it. He cut another fiber. He loosened another twist. He worked until the rain stopped and the first birds began to call in the darkness before dawn. Let us pause here for a moment. Feel the surface beneath you. Feel it holding you completely. You do not need to hold yourself up. You are supported. Let your breath come easily. Let your body soften. There is nowhere you need to be but here. Over the weeks that followed, Arjun's sabotaged rope made its way into the hands of workers across the region. A farmer used it to tether a bullock cart, and the rope held, for it was not under great stress. A builder used it to lash scaffolding, and the rope held, for the load was light. Each time the rope held, Arjun's confidence grew. He told himself that the weakened knots would fail eventually, in small ways, causing frustration and complaints that would erode Vikram's reputation like wind eroding a hillside. A frayed end here, a knot that slipped there. Small failures, manageable failures. But Arjun had forgotten something fundamental about rope. Rope does not exist for small tasks alone. Rope exists for the moments when everything depends upon it, when a life hangs in the balance, when the full weight of a human body swings over an abyss, and the only thing between breath and silence is the strength of twisted fiber. A well digger named Gopal purchased a length of rope from a traveling merchant who had bought it at discount, believing it to be Vikram's surplus. Gopal was a careful man. He checked the rope's diameter. He tested its flexibility. He examined the knots. Everything appeared sound. The rope looked strong. It felt strong. It had the weight and texture of good rope. Gopal worked in a region of dry plains where villages depended on deep wells for water. The work was dangerous. A well digger descended into darkness, into shafts 30 or 40 feet deep, sometimes more, carved into rock and earth. The rope was his lifeline. The rope was everything. On a morning when the sun rose red over the plains and the air was already warm, Gopal lowered himself into a new well shaft. The stone was cool against his back. The light from above grew smaller as he descended. The rope creaked softly as it bore his weight, and the sound was familiar and reassuring, a sound he had heard 10,000 times. At 32 feet, the knot gave way. It did not fray. It did not gradually weaken. It simply opened like a hand releasing what it held, and Gopal fell. The men above heard the rope snap, and then a sound from below that they would carry in their memories for the rest of their lives. They called down into the darkness. There was no answer. When they finally pulled Gopal's body from the well shaft, his neck was broken. His eyes were still open. His hands were still curled, as if gripping a rope that was no longer there. The rope was examined. The knot that had failed was brought to the elder rope makers of the region, men whose fingers could read rope the way a scholar reads text. They saw immediately what had been done. The weakening was deliberate. The cuts were precise. This was not wear or age or poor craftsmanship. This was intention. The investigation moved quickly. The merchant who had sold the rope was found. He identified his supplier. The trail led back, link by link, like a chain being followed to its anchor, to Arjun's workshop. When the guild inspectors arrived at Arjun's door, they found what they needed. Lengths of Vikram's rope in various stages of sabotage, Arjun's blade, still bearing fibers, a ledger of transactions with the intermediary boys. Everything was there, laid out with the terrible neatness of a man who had never expected to be caught. Arjun did not deny what he had done, but he said over and over that he had not intended for anyone to die. He had only wanted to damage Vikram's reputation. He had only wanted his customers back. He had only wanted what was fair. The magistrate listened to all of this with a still face. When Arjun finished speaking, the magistrate said, "You weakened rope that you knew would be used to bear the weight of human lives. You did this deliberately over many weeks, with skill and planning. Whether you wished for death or not, you made death possible. You tied it into the fiber. You knotted it into the rope. And when the rope was asked to do what rope must do, it delivered what you had placed inside it." Arjun was convicted of murder. The sentence was death. On the day of his execution, the rope used was tested 3 times by 3 different masters. It was strong. Its knots were true. The rope held. The Buddha, upon hearing this story from a traveling monk, sat quietly for a long time. The evening light was golden, falling through the trees where he rested with his disciples. Insects hummed in the warm air. A river could be heard in the distance, moving slowly over stones. Finally, the Buddha said, "He tied death into rope, and the noose found his own neck." The disciples sat with this in silence. This story shows us the nature of intended harm and its inevitable return. Arjun discovered that when we deliberately weaken what others depend upon, we cannot control the consequences of that weakness. We may intend a small harm, a minor inconvenience, a gentle erosion of reputation, but the world does not obey our intentions. The world follows the logic of what we have actually done. Buddhism teaches a principle called karma, which is not punishment or reward from some distant judge, but simply the natural unfolding of cause and effect. When we plant seeds of harm, we cannot choose which fruit they bear. Arjuna planted the seed of sabotage, expecting the fruit of competitive advantage. But the seed grew according to its own nature, not according to his wishes. When we are tempted to harm others, even in small ways, even in ways we believe we can control, we would do well to remember Arjuna's rope. The harm we build into the world does not stay where we put it. It travels. It moves through hands and across distances. And when it finds its full expression, it often returns to the one who created it, bearing consequences far greater than what was intended. Let your breath settle now. Let your body rest more deeply into the surface that holds you. Feel the gentle weight of your limbs. There is nothing to carry, nothing to fix. You are safe here. Notice the air on your skin. Cool or warm, it does not matter. Simply notice it. Let your awareness rest on the simple sensation of being alive, being held, being still. Let us explore another story now, a quieter one, but no less true. In a region of hills and valleys, where small villages clung to the slopes like birds' nests in the branches of a tree, there lived many wandering ascetics. These were men and women who had renounced worldly possessions, who had given up homes and families and trades to walk the roads in search of spiritual truth. They wore simple robes, often torn and patched. They carried begging bowls and depended on the generosity of villagers for their daily rice. The people of these villages respected the ascetics deeply. To feed a holy person was considered a great merit. To offer shelter or cloth or medicine was to invest in one's own spiritual future. This was the understanding, and it was ancient and sincere. Among these wanderers was a man named Devesh. Devesh was tall and thin, with the gaunt face of a man who had fasted many times. His robes were deliberately poor, stained with dust, torn at the hem, as if they had weathered many years of walking. His feet were bare and hardened. His hair was matted and long. He looked, in every way, like a man who had surrendered everything for the path. When he entered a village, he walked slowly, with his eyes cast down. He spoke softly, using the language of scripture. He quoted ancient texts with a fluency that impressed even the village elders. He sat beneath trees in meditation, perfectly still, for hours at a time, and villagers would gather at a distance to watch, murmuring to each other about the depth of his practice. They gave generously. Rice and lentils and fruit filled his bowl. Coins were pressed into his hands. Cloth for robes was offered. In some villages, families competed for the merit of feeding him, each household insisting that Devesh accept their hospitality. And Devesh accepted. He accepted everything. He ate the food, which was real enough. He wore the cloth sometimes. He blessed the families in return, touching their heads with his dusty palm, murmuring words that sounded sacred. But the coins did not go toward medicine or offerings at temples. The coins went into a false bottom that Devesh had carefully constructed in his begging bowl. The bowl was clay, ordinary in appearance, rough and cracked and chipped, but its base was hollow, sealed with a thin layer of dried mud that could be pried open and pressed shut again. Inside this space, coins accumulated. Gold coins, silver coins, small copper pieces that added up, over the years, to a considerable sum. Devesh was not poor. Devesh was not a renunciant. Devesh was a merchant of deception, trading in the appearance of holiness. He had begun this life many years earlier, in a town far to the south, where he had been a cloth merchant of middling success. The work was hard and the profits thin. One day he watched a wandering monk receive in a single afternoon what would have taken Devesh a week to earn at his stall. The monk simply sat. People brought him food, people brought him cloth, people brought him coins, all for sitting and looking holy. Something shifted in Devesh that day. Not enlightenment, not a calling, something colder, an observation, a calculation. He saw an opportunity. He spent months preparing. He learned to quote scriptures by memorizing the sounds without fully understanding the meanings. He practiced sitting still, which was harder than he expected. He let his hair grow. He stopped bathing. He tore his best cloth into convincing rags. And when he was satisfied with the disguise, he left his town and began walking. That was 12 years ago. 12 years of walking from village to village. 12 years of downcast eyes and softly spoken blessings. 12 years of a begging bowl growing heavier with hidden gold, while his voice spoke of the virtue of letting go. There was a particular cruelty in this deception, though Devesh did not see it as cruelty. The villagers who fed him were often poor themselves. The rice they placed in his bowl was rice their children might have eaten. The coins they gave were coins saved over months for festivals or medicines. They gave because they believed in the sacred exchange, that feeding a genuine seeker of truth generated spiritual merit that would bless their families. But there was no merit in feeding a fraud. The exchange was hollow, like the bottom of his bowl. Devesh moved carefully. He never stayed in one village long enough for questions to form. He never returned to the same region within a year. He kept his routes varied and unpredictable. He avoided other ascetics, whose trained eyes might see through his performance. He was, in his own way, as skilled in deception as Arjun had been in sabotage. The same precision, the same attention to detail, the same careful management of appearances. But there is a pattern in these stories, as there is a pattern in life. The thing we hide has a way of revealing itself, not through divine intervention, not through magic, simply through the natural accumulation of consequences. A hidden weight cannot be hidden forever. A false bottom, no matter how cleverly constructed, is still a flaw in the structure. It was late autumn when Devesh made his last journey. The air was cool, and the trees along the road were turning gold and copper, shedding leaves that drifted down in slow spirals. He had been walking for 3 days between villages, sleeping beneath trees, eating the last of the rice given to him at his previous stop. His bowl was heavy, heavier than it had ever been. He had considered more than once finding a place to bury some of the coins, but he could not bear to part with them. They were his security, his proof that the world could be tricked. He walked alone on a road that wound through a forested valley. The light was dappled, falling through branches in patterns that shifted with the wind. Birds called in the canopy above. A stream ran somewhere nearby, the sound of it soft and constant. It was a beautiful place, peaceful, the kind of place where a genuine seeker might sit and feel the boundaries between self and world begin to dissolve. Devesh felt nothing of this. He was thinking about how much gold he had accumulated and where he might eventually go to spend it. A distant city, perhaps, where no one knew his face. A house, good food, servants. The life he had been unable to afford as a cloth merchant, purchased with 12 years of performed poverty. He did not see the men until they stepped onto the road in front of him. There were 3 of them. Road bandits, lean and weathered, with the watchful eyes of men who lived by observing others. They carried short blades and wooden clubs. Devesh was not afraid, not at first. Robbers rarely bothered ascetics. There was nothing to steal from a wandering holy man. A bowl of rice, torn robes, a walking stick. Nothing worth the risk of the spiritual consequence that villagers believed fell upon those who harmed the renounced. Devesh held up his hands in the gesture of peace. He spoke softly. He blessed them. He offered to share his rice. But one of the robbers, a man with a scar across his left eyebrow, did not look at Devesh's hands or his robes or his matted hair. He looked at the bowl. He watched how Devesh held it, close to his body, both hands, the way a merchant holds something valuable. The robber said, "Your bowl is heavy for a man with nothing." Devesh felt something cold move through his chest. "It is only clay," he said. "Clay does not make a man grip it so tightly." Devesh tried to laugh. The sound was thin and false, and all three robbers heard the falseness in it. What happened next was swift and without ceremony. The robbers took the bowl. They broke it open on a rock, and the gold spilled out into the autumn leaves like a secret the earth had been holding and could no longer contain. The robbers stared. Devesh stared. For a long moment, the only sound was the stream and the wind in the branches above. Then the scar-browed robber looked at Devesh with an expression that was not anger, not greed, but something closer to disgust. "A holy man," he said, "with a merchant's heart." They took the gold. All of it. 12 years of deception, gathered coin by coin from the hands of the poor, swept up in moments. And because Devesh fought them, because he lunged for the coins with a desperation that no true ascetic would possess, they struck him down. They left him on the road among the scattered leaves and the broken pieces of his bowl. The false bottom lay in 2 pieces beside him. The clay was just clay. The gold was gone, and Devesh did not rise again. Let us rest here for a moment. Your breath continues its gentle rhythm, in and out, like the tide, like the wind. There is nothing you need to hold on to. Let your hands soften. Let your jaw release. Feel the gentle heaviness settling into your limbs, the kind that comes when the body remembers it is allowed to rest. When travelers found Devesh's body the next day, they saw the broken bowl and the false bottom and understood immediately what he had been. Word spread quickly, as it does in small communities connected by single roads. The villages where Devesh had begged learned of his deception. Families who had given their rice, their coins, their reverence, learned that they had been feeding a lie. The reaction was not anger so much as a deep, quiet sadness, and something harder beneath the sadness. The feeling of trust abused, the feeling of generosity made foolish. Some villagers became suspicious of all wandering ascetics after that. Some refused to give. The genuine seekers who walked those roads in the months that followed found fewer open hands and more closed doors. Devesh's fraud did not end with his death. It rippled outward, like the rings that spread across water when a stone is dropped. It poisoned the well of generosity for those who came after. It made trust harder. It made giving feel dangerous. And this, perhaps, was the deepest harm. No one mourned Devesh. His body was buried by the road, without ceremony, without chanting, without the prayers that would have been offered to a genuine seeker. His grave was unmarked. The gold he had hoarded was spent by robbers within a season. The robes he wore rotted into the earth. Nothing remained of his 12 years of deception except the damage it had done to others' faith. A monk who heard the story while passing through the region sat in silence for a long time. The afternoon light was fading. insects gathered in the warm air. The monk watched them circle and settle, and finally spoke. He wore renunciation like a costume while greed lived in his heart. Both the costume and the heart were buried together. This story shows us the nature of spiritual fraud and its consequences. Devesh discovered that deception, even when it succeeds for years, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The weight of what we hide eventually reveals itself. The false bottom of his bowl was a perfect mirror of his life, an appearance of emptiness concealing hidden accumulation. Buddhism teaches that right livelihood, one element of the Noble Eightfold Path, means earning our way through the world without deception, without exploitation, without pretending to be what we are not. Devesh violated this teaching at its deepest level, using the appearance of the sacred path itself as a tool for personal gain. When we present ourselves falsely, when we wear masks of virtue to extract generosity from others, we do not merely harm ourselves, we harm every genuine seeker who comes after us. We harm every generous heart that learns to close. We poison a well that others need to drink from. And notice this: the robbers were not Devesh's true punishment. They were simply the mechanism through which consequences arrived. The true cost of Devesh's deception was that he lived for 12 years without genuine connection. Every blessing he received was based on a lie. Every meal was flavored with fraud. Every village that welcomed him welcomed a person who did not exist. He was, in the deepest sense, already a ghost long before he died on that autumn road. Let your breath soften again now. Notice how your body has settled more deeply since we began. There is a wisdom in the body that the mind sometimes forgets. The body knows how to let go. The body knows how to rest. Trust it now. Feel the weight of your head on the pillow. Feel the gentle pull of gravity, not as a force but as an embrace. The earth holds you. It has always held you. You do not need to hold yourself. Let us explore another story now. A gentler one in some ways, but one that touches a tender place. A story about what we teach without meaning to teach. A story about what children learn when we think they are not watching. In a fertile valley where green fields stretched to the horizon and the air smelled of grass and warm earth, there lived a dairyman named Suresh. He was a large man, strong from years of physical work, with broad hands that could steady a restless cow with a single firm touch. His dairy was prosperous. 20 cows stood in his barn, their flanks sleek with good health, their udders full with rich milk that Suresh sold each morning to the merchants who came from the nearby town. Suresh was not a cruel man. At least, he did not think of himself as cruel. He fed his cows well. He kept the barn clean. He treated illness promptly. In the language of his trade, he was a good dairyman, but Suresh had developed a practice that troubled some who witnessed it, though he dismissed their concerns with the confidence of a man who knows his business. When a cow gave birth, Suresh separated the calf from its mother within hours, sometimes within minutes. The calf was moved to a separate pen on the far side of the barn, where it was fed by hand with a mixture of milk and grain. The mother was milked immediately and fully, her production directed entirely toward the containers that would be carried to market the next morning. The reasoning was simple and, in the logic of commerce, sound. A calf, nursing from its mother, consumed milk that could be sold. Every mouthful the calf took was a mouthful lost to profit. By separating them early, before the bond between mother and young had fully formed, Suresh maximized his yield. It was efficient. It was standard practice among the most productive dairies in the region, but efficiency has a sound, and in Suresh's barn, that sound was the lowing of cows calling for their calves through the long hours of the night. It was a deep, resonant sound, not quite a cry, something lower and more persistent, a sound that came from the chest, from the belly, from some place that knew what had been taken, even when the mind could not name it. The calves answered. Their voices were thinner, higher, confused. They called back through the wooden walls that separated them, and the two sounds, the deep and the high, wove together into a chorus that filled the barn from dusk until the animals' exhaustion finally silenced them. Suresh heard this sound every night. At first, years ago, it had unsettled him. He had lain in his bed in the house adjacent to the barn and felt something move in his chest, an answering heaviness. But he had learned to interpret this feeling as sentimentality, weakness, a distraction from the practical requirements of his work. Over the years, the sound became background. He stopped hearing it the way one stops hearing the wind or the river. It became part of the fabric of his life, unremarkable and unremarked upon. His wife, Lata, heard it differently. She had nursed their own son Ravi, and the sound of a mother calling for her young stirred something in her that she could not set aside as easily as Suresh could. She mentioned it once, early in their marriage. "The cows sound distressed," she said carefully. "They adjust," Suresh replied. "In a day or two, they forget." Lata was not certain this was true. She had watched the cows press against the walls of their stalls in the direction of the calves' pen. She had seen them refuse food for days. She had noticed how the oldest cows, the ones who had been through many separations, had a dullness in their eyes that was different from the bright, curious gaze of a cow who had never given birth. But Suresh was the dairyman. It was his trade. She did not raise the subject again. Their son, Ravi, grew up in the barn. He took his first steps on the packed earth floor between the stalls. He learned to walk by, holding onto the wooden rails that divided one cow from another. The smell of hay and warm milk was the smell of his childhood. The sounds of the barn were his lullaby, including the sound of separation. Ravi watched his father pull calves away from their mothers. He watched the mothers strain against their ropes. He heard the calling. He saw his father's face during these moments, calm, efficient, unmoved. And from all of this, Ravi learned something that Suresh never intended to teach. He learned that separation was normal, that the bond between mother and child was negotiable, that the needs of production outweighed the needs of connection, that distress, when it came from a creature with no voice to argue, could be safely ignored. He learned this not from words. No one told him these things. He learned them the way children learn most of what they know, by watching, by absorbing, by building a picture of how the world works from the 1,000 small observations that accumulate, like sediment, layer by layer, until they form the ground a child stands on. By the time Ravi was 7 years old, he had developed a coolness toward his own mother that confused and frightened her. When Lata reached for him, he pulled away. When she spoke to him with warmth, he answered in short, flat words. When she tried to embrace him, he stood rigid in her arms, waiting for the embrace to end, the way a calf stands rigid in the hands of the man who carries it away from its mother. Lata noticed. Of course she noticed. A mother notices. She watched her son move through the house with a self-containment that was unnatural in a child so young. He did not seek comfort when he fell. He did not cry when he was hurt. He did not reach for her hand when they walked together to the market. He walked beside her at a careful distance, like a small adult who had already decided that closeness was a kind of weakness. Suresh did not notice, or rather, he noticed and approved. "The boy is strong," he told Lata, "independent. He will do well in the world." But Lata saw something different. She saw the barn in her son's eyes. She saw the lesson of separation written into his small body, into the way he held himself apart, into the way he flinched when touched. She saw her husband's calm efficiency reflected in her child's careful distance, and it frightened her in a way she could not articulate. One evening, when Ravi was 8, Lata found him in the barn, standing before the calves' pen. It was dusk. The light was amber and soft, falling through the gaps in the wooden walls in long, slanting lines. The calves were quiet, huddled together in the straw, their dark eyes watching the boy with the patient wariness of animals who have learned early that humans bring change. Ravi was not petting them. He was not speaking to them. He was simply standing there, his hands at his sides, watching them with an expression that Lata could not read. "Ravi," she said softly. He did not turn. "What are you doing?" "Watching," he said. "What do you see?" There was a pause. The calves shifted in the straw. Somewhere in the barn, a cow lowed once, a single note that hung in the warm air. "They stopped calling," Ravi said. "The new ones. They called for 2 days, and now they have stopped." "Yes," Lata said. "Father says they forget." Lata knelt beside her son. The straw was rough under her knees. She could smell the calves, the sweet, grassy scent of young animals. "What do you think?" she asked. Ravi was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think they just stop expecting anyone to come." Lata felt something break open in her chest, a door she had kept closed, a truth she had not allowed herself to speak. She put her arm around her son, and for once, for the first time in months, he did not pull away. He leaned into her, just slightly, the way a plant leans toward light. "That is not the same as forgetting," Lata said. "No," Ravi said, "it is not." They sat together in the dimming light of the barn, mother and son, listening to the silence of animals who had stopped calling. And in that silence, Lata heard everything. She heard the cost of her husband's efficiency. She heard the lesson her son had absorbed. She heard the years of lowing that she had allowed to become background noise. She heard her own complicity in a harm she had recognized, but not resisted. The next morning, Lata spoke to Suresh. Not about the cows, not directly. She spoke about Ravi. "He does not let me hold him," she said. "He does not come to me when he is hurt. He watches the calves being separated, and he learns that this is how the world works, that mothers and children are meant to be pulled apart. That need is something to be overcome quickly, efficiently, like an illness." Suresh listened with the patience of a man hearing something he did not consider important. "You are making too much of this," he said. "Boys become independent. It is natural." "There is a difference between independence and numbness," Lata said. Suresh waved his hand. "The boy is fine. The cows are fine. The dairy is prosperous. You worry about things that do not need worrying about." Lata looked at her husband. She loved him. She knew he was not unkind. She knew he believed what he said. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her like stone, that he was wrong. But she did not know what to do about it. Not yet. Let us pause here for a moment. Your breath continues, in and out. Notice how it has slowed since we began. Notice how your body has grown heavier, warmer, more willing to rest. This is not something you need to create. It is something that is already happening. Simply allow it. Feel the quiet around you. Feel the stillness. You are held by this moment the way the earth holds a river, gently, completely, without effort. It was a wandering nun who changed things. Her name was Ananda, and she arrived in the valley on a cool morning when mist hung low over the green fields and the world seemed wrapped in cloth. She was old, small, bent slightly at the shoulders, as if she had spent many years bowing. Her robes were faded, but clean. Her begging bowl was simple, unchipped, well cared for. She moved slowly, not from weakness, but from attention, as if each step was a conversation with the ground beneath her. She came to Suresh's dairy because she had heard the sound. She had been sleeping in a grove of trees a quarter mile from the barn, and the lowing of the cows had reached her through the still night air. She had lain awake listening, and what she heard was not merely animal distress. She heard a teaching, a lesson being spoken in a language older than words. In the morning, she walked to the dairy and asked for milk. Suresh was generous to holy people. Whatever his faults, he respected the renounced. He filled her bowl with fresh milk, warm and frothy, and she thanked him and sat beneath a banyan tree near the barn to drink it. Ravi found her there. Children are drawn to unusual people, and the old nun was unusual. She sat so still that a sparrow had landed on her shoulder, and she had not moved. Ravi watched from behind a fence post for several minutes before the nun spoke without turning her head. "You may come closer if you wish." Ravi approached. He sat down across from her, cross-legged, his back straight, maintaining his careful distance. "You live here?" Ananda asked. "Yes. My father owns the dairy." "It is a fine dairy. The cows are healthy." Ravi said nothing. "But something troubles you," the nun observed. Not a question, a simple recognition. Ravi looked at her. His face was composed, as it always was, but something moved behind his eyes. "The calves," he said. "Tell me." "My father takes them from their mothers, right away, before they have even dried from being born. He says it is necessary. He says they forget." "And what do you say?" "They do not forget. They stop expecting." Ananda nodded slowly. The sparrow on her shoulder ruffled its feathers and settled again. "That is a very wise observation for someone your age. Tell me, do you know why it troubles you so?" Ravi was quiet. He picked at the grass beside him, pulling up small blades and letting them fall. "Because I think I am like the calves," he said at last, and his voice was very small. Ananda looked at the boy for a long time. Her eyes were dark and clear, like deep water. They held no pity, which would have embarrassed him. They held something else, recognition, the recognition of one being seeing clearly into another. "You have stopped expecting," she said. Ravi nodded. He did not cry. He had trained himself not to cry, but his hands shook slightly as they pulled at the grass, and the nun saw this too. "Would you bring your mother and father to me this evening?" Ananda asked. "I would like to share a teaching with your family in exchange for the milk." Ravi agreed. And that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the sky turned the color of ripe peaches, the family gathered beneath the banyan tree. Suresh sat with the broad-shouldered ease of a man in his own domain. Lata sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between the nun and her son. Ravi sat between his parents, equidistant from both, belonging fully to neither. Ananda did not begin with scripture. She did not quote texts or invoke lineages. She began with a question. "Suresh, you are a good dairyman?" "I believe so," Suresh said. "My cows are healthy. My milk is pure. My customers are satisfied." "And you separate the calves from their mothers?" Suresh's jaw tightened slightly. It is standard practice. It maximizes yield. I see. And the cows, do they object? They low for a day or two, then they adjust. Adjust, Ananda repeated. She let the word sit in the air for a moment. Tell me, Suresh, if someone took Ravi from you tonight, carried him away to a neighboring village, and you called for him and no one answered, and after 2 days you stopped calling, would you say you had adjusted? Suresh did not answer immediately. The question was so direct, so simple, that it left no room for the usual defenses. He looked at Ravi, who was staring at the ground. That is different, Suresh said. Is it? A cow is not a person. No, Ananda agreed. A cow is not a person, but is a cow a mother? Silence. The evening insects had begun their chorus. The air was cooling. In the barn, a cow shifted in her stall, her hooves quiet on the straw. A cow is a mother, Suresh said reluctantly. And does a mother's bond with her young depend on whether she can speak about it? Does the pain of separation require language to be real? Suresh was quiet. I am not here to judge your livelihood, Ananda said, and her voice was gentle, truly gentle. Not the performed gentleness of someone making a point, but the genuine warmth of someone who understood the difficulty of what she was asking. I am here because your son is learning something you did not intend to teach him. She turned to Ravi. Tell your father what you told me today. Ravi looked up. His face was still, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been courage. I watch you take the calves away, he said to his father, every time, and I see that you do not feel anything when you do it. And I learned from that. I learned that when someone is taken away, you should not feel anything either. You should just adjust. He paused. The word hung in the air. I adjusted, Father. I adjusted to not needing Mother. I adjusted to not needing anyone. I thought that was what you wanted. Suresh stared at his son, and for the first time, the calm, efficient expression that he wore like armor began to crack. Not dramatically. Suresh was not a dramatic man, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recognition, a seeing. He looked at the barn. He looked at Ravi. He looked at Lata, whose eyes were wet and whose hands were pressed together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I did not know, Suresh said. His voice was rough. No, Ananda said, you did not. And that is the deepest teaching here. We do not always know what we are teaching. Our children watch everything we do. They watch how we treat animals. They watch how we treat strangers. They watch how we respond to suffering. And from these observations, they build their understanding of what is normal, what is acceptable, what the world requires of them. She paused. The evening was deepening. The first stars had appeared in the sky above the banyan tree, faint and patient. You are not a cruel man, Suresh. I can see this. But you have practiced a small cruelty so many times that it has become invisible to you. And your son has been watching. And he has learned that cruelty, when practiced calmly and efficiently, is simply how things are done. Suresh sat with his head bowed. The broad shoulders that had always seemed so certain, so solid, seemed smaller now. Not defeated, something else, softened. What would you have me do? He asked. I would not have you do anything, Ananda said. It is not my place to direct your livelihood, but I will ask you a question, and you may sit with it for as long as you need. She leaned forward slightly. Is it possible to be prosperous and also kind? Is there a way to run your dairy that allows a calf to stay with its mother a little longer? You may produce less milk, your profits may thin, but what might your son learn then? What lesson would he absorb if he watched you choose compassion, even when it cost you something? Ananda did not wait for an answer. She rose slowly, thanked them for the milk, and walked into the gathering darkness along the road that led out of the valley. The sparrow that had sat on her shoulder was gone now, settled somewhere in the branches above for the night. The family sat beneath the tree in silence for a long time. It was Ravi who moved first. He shifted on the grass. He looked at his mother, and then, slowly, deliberately, like a door that has been closed for a long time swinging open on rusted hinges, he leaned against her. Lada put her arm around him. She did not cry, though she wanted to. She simply held her son and felt the small warmth of his body against hers, and understood that something had begun to change. Suresh watched them, and something in his chest that had been closed for years, something he had sealed as neatly as Devesh had sealed the bottom of his bowl, began to open. The next morning, when a cow gave birth to a small brown calf, wet and blinking in the straw, Suresh stood in the stall and watched the mother turn to her young. She licked the calf with her broad, rough tongue. She nudged it toward her udder. The calf found its footing and began to nurse, its small tail switching back and forth. Suresh reached out to take the calf, as he had done hundreds of times. His hands knew the motion. His arms knew the weight. The routine was as natural as breathing. He stopped. He stood there with his hands extended, frozen in the gesture of separation, and he felt the full weight of what he had been doing. Not just to the cows, not just to the calves, to his son, to his wife, to himself. He felt it in his hands, in his arms, in his chest, in the place where a father's love had been made quiet by the logic of efficiency. He lowered his hands. He stepped back. He let the calf nurse. The yield that morning was lower. The merchants received less milk. The coins in Suresh's pouch were fewer. But when Ravi came into the barn and saw the calf beside its mother, still nursing, still there, something happened in the boy's face that was worth more than every coin Suresh had ever earned. Ravi smiled. Not a large smile, not the grin of a child at play. A quiet smile. The smile of someone who has just learned that the world can be different from what he believed. And Lata, standing in the doorway of the barn, watching her husband and her son, and the cow and her calf, all of them together in the warm morning light, felt something she had not felt in years. She felt that her family was whole. This story shows us how our actions teach, even when we are not speaking. Suresh discovered that his son had absorbed the lesson of every separation he witnessed, building from it a worldview in which closeness was expendable and distance was strength. Buddhism teaches the concept of right action, which extends beyond the obvious prohibitions against killing and stealing to include the subtler ways we shape the world around us. When we practice small cruelties, even ones we consider normal, even ones that are common in our trade or culture, we are not merely acting, we are teaching. Every person who watches us, especially the children, is learning from our example what the world expects, what is permitted, what is the cost of caring. Suresh's harm was not malicious. That is what makes this story tender. He was not Arjun, deliberately weakening rope. He was not Devesh, consciously deceiving the faithful. He was a good man practicing a common cruelty without examining it. And the cost was borne, not by him, but by his son, who learned to close himself the way a calf learns to stop calling. When we pause to examine our habitual actions, when we ask ourselves what lesson our behavior teaches to those who watch us, we create the possibility of change. Not dramatic change, the quiet change of a man lowering his hands, the quiet change of a boy leaning against his mother, the quiet change of allowing what is natural to remain unbroken. Let your breath settle now. Let these stories rest inside you like stones settling in a stream. They do not need to be held. They do not need to be analyzed. They will find their place as water finds its level naturally without force. Feel your body growing heavier. Feel the warmth of rest spreading through you. Your eyelids may be heavy. Let them be heavy. There is nothing you need to see right now. There is nothing you need to watch for. You are safe. You are held. The night holds you the way the earth holds the river, without effort, without end. Let us explore another story now. This one takes us to a different kind of harm. The harm of scales that lie. The harm of a weight that is not what it seems. In a market town that sat at the crossroads of two ancient trading routes, there lived a grain merchant named Padma. She was a woman of middle years, neither young nor old, with dark hair threaded with early silver and hands that were always in motion, measuring, counting, pouring grain from one vessel to another with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her life in commerce. Padma's stall was the largest in the market. She sold rice, wheat, millet, and lentils in quantities that ranged from a single day's meal for a poor family to sacks that would feed a household for a month. Her grain was good quality. Her stall was clean. Her manner was brisk but not unkind. She greeted regular customers by name and remembered details about their families. She was, by all visible measures, a successful and respectable merchant, but Padma's scales were not true. The deception was subtle, so subtle that no casual observer would detect it. She had commissioned the scales from a metalworker in a distant town, paying extra for a specific modification. The balance arm was not perfectly centered. It was offset by the width of a single grain of rice, no more. This tiny asymmetry meant that when grain was weighed, the measurement consistently favored Padma. Not by much. Not enough for any single customer to notice. But across a day of transactions, the accumulated difference was significant. Across a week, it was considerable. Across a year, it amounted to hundreds of pounds of grain that Padma received in payment, but did not deliver. She had begun this practice 5 years earlier, during a drought year when grain prices soared and her own suppliers raised their costs. She had been struggling. Her margins were thin. Her family depended on the stall's income. The modification to the scales had seemed at the time a small thing, a slight correction, a way of recovering what felt like unfair losses imposed by circumstances beyond her control. But the drought ended. The prices normalized. Her margins recovered, and the scales remained as they were. Padma told herself she would have them corrected. She told herself this weekly, then monthly, then not at all. The extra profit had become part of her accounting. Her household expenses had expanded to absorb it. Her children attended a better school. Her home had been improved. To correct the scales now would mean reducing her income, which would mean reducing her family's comfort. And comfort, once established, resists reduction with a stubbornness that rivals stone. So the scales stayed, and Padma weighed grain each day with hands that were quick and sure, and a smile that was genuine. And the tiny theft continued, invisible, constant, like a slow leak in a vessel that loses water, drop by drop, without anyone noticing the level falling. The people who suffered were the ones who could least afford it. The wealthy merchants who bought grain in bulk were affected proportionally less. They had margins of their own. But the poor families, the ones who counted their coins carefully and bought exactly enough rice for 3 days because that was all they could afford, these families received slightly less than they paid for. Their rice ran out a few hours before they expected. Their children went to bed with bellies not quite full. The difference was small, invisible almost, but hunger does not require visibility to be real. There was an old woman named Mira who came to Padma's stall every fourth day. Mira was a widow who survived on the small income she earned by mending clothes for her neighbors. Her hands were stiff with age, but still nimble enough to thread a needle and close a torn seam. She earned just enough to feed herself and her granddaughter, a girl of 5 named Chitra, who lived with her because the child's parents had died of fever 2 years before. Mira always bought exactly 1 measure of rice. She knew from years of careful living exactly how long 1 measure lasted. She knew how many handfuls it yielded, how many meals it made, how thin the porridge could be stretched before it was merely water with the memory of grain. And she knew, though she could not prove it, that her rice was running short. "It seems less," she said to her neighbor one morning, holding up the cloth bag in which she stored her grain. "I buy the same amount every time, but lately it does not last. Chitra is growing, yes, but not so quickly that it would explain this." Her neighbor shrugged. "Perhaps you are imagining it." "Perhaps," Mira said, but she was not imagining it. Her hands knew the weight of rice. Her eyes knew the level in the bag. Something was wrong, and the wrongness was costing her and her granddaughter a meal every 4th day. They went to bed hungry on those nights. Chitra did not complain. She was a quiet child who had already learned, at 5 years old, that some hungers simply had to be endured. It was on one of these hungry evenings that Mira sat outside her small house, watching Chitra sleep on the mat inside, the child's ribs visible beneath her thin cotton shift, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not anger. Mira was too old and too tired for anger. Something quieter. A question. Why was the world arranged so that a woman who worked every day, who mended clothes until her fingers ached, who counted every coin and wasted nothing, could not feed a child? She did not know about the scales. She did not know that every 4th day, when she handed her coins to Padma and received her measure of rice, she was being given less than she had paid for. She did not know that the handful of rice that would have made the difference between a full belly and an empty one for her granddaughter was sitting in Padma's storehouse, absorbed into the accumulated surplus of 1,000 such tiny thefts. She knew only that the rice ran short, and that Chitra was thin, and that the nights when there was not enough were growing more frequent. Let us rest here for a moment. Feel your breath moving in your body. Feel how it arrives without effort, how it leaves without instruction. You do not need to manage this. Your body breathes as the river flows, as the wind moves through trees. It has its own rhythm, its own wisdom. Trust it now. Let your shoulders drop. Perhaps they have risen without your noticing, drawn up toward your ears by the quiet tension of listening. Let them fall. Let the muscles of your neck soften. Let your face relax. The space between your eyebrows, let it smooth. The hinge of your jaw, let it loosen. There is nothing to hold together right now. You are allowed to come apart, gently, the way a flower opens. Not because it decides to, because the warmth invites it. Now, let us return to Padma. Padma's scales had been dishonest for 5 years when Otham, new merchant, arrived in the market. His name was Hari, and he sold not grain but spices, turmeric and cumin and coriander and small, fiery red chilies that he kept in clay pots arranged in neat rows along his counter. Hari was a quiet man with observant eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who has traveled widely and seen much. He set up his stall across from Padma's, and from his position, behind his rows of clay pots, he watched the market move through its daily rhythms. He watched the way merchants greeted one another. He watched the way customers moved from stall to stall, comparing quality and price. He watched the children who darted between the legs of adults, carrying messages and stealing fruit. He watched everything with the patient attention of a man for whom observation was not a habit, but a practice, and he watched Padma weigh grain. Hari had spent years in distant markets where deception was an art form, where false weights and rigged scales were so common that experienced merchants carried their own measuring tools. He had learned to read the subtle signs, the slight hesitation before placing grain on the scale, the positioning of the counterweight just a fraction off-center, the speed with which grain was swept from the scale into the customer's bag before the balance had fully settled. He saw none of these crude tricks in Padma's work. Her hands were steady. Her manner was confident. She allowed the scales to settle fully before reading the weight. She did everything correctly, and yet something was not right. He could not identify it for several days. It nagged at him the way a sound just below the threshold of hearing nags, present but unplaceable. He watched Padma weigh grain for customer after customer, and each transaction appeared perfectly fair. The scale tipped, the counterweight was placed, the grain was measured, the bag was filled. It was the scale itself. Hari noticed it on a still morning when no breeze disturbed the market, and the scale hung motionless between transactions. Empty, the scale should have been perfectly level. Both pans should have hung at exactly the same height, but Padma's scale, when empty, showed a discrepancy so slight that only someone looking for it would see it. One pan hung a hair's breadth lower than the other, not the grain pan, the counterweight pan. This meant that every measurement required slightly more grain to achieve balance. The customer's grain had to outweigh the counterweight by a tiny margin before the scale would read as even. It was elegant. It was invisible to anyone who was not specifically watching for it. And it was theft. Hari said nothing. Not that day. He sat behind his spices and watched and thought. He was not a man who acted hastily. He had learned, through years of travel and trade, that the way a problem is approached matters as much as the solution itself. Confrontation would accomplish nothing. Padma would deny it. The scales would be adjusted, and the lesson would be lost. Instead, Hari waited for the right moment, and the right moment arrived, as it often does, not when he planned it, but when circumstances arranged themselves into a shape that invited action. It was a festival day, 3 weeks after Hari's arrival. The market was crowded. Families from surrounding villages had come to buy provisions for the celebrations. The air smelled of incense and marigolds, and the sweet, heavy scent of jaggery being melted for sweets. Musicians played somewhere nearby, a drum and a flute weaving patterns that floated over the noise of commerce. The regional magistrate had come to the market, as was customary on festival days, to inspect the stalls and ensure that standards were being maintained. He was accompanied by the market inspector, a man whose job it was to verify weights and measures. The inspector carried a set of certified standard weights in a leather case. Weights that had been calibrated against the regional standard and bore the magistrate's seal. This was routine. The inspector visited the market 4 times a year. Merchants knew this, and merchants whose scales were true had nothing to fear. Padma saw the inspector approaching and felt, for the first time in 5 years, a flutter of unease. She had survived previous inspections because the discrepancy in her scales was so small that the standard check, which involved placing a known weight on the scale and reading the result, rarely caught it. The inspector's own weights had small tolerances. The margin of Padma's deception fell within these tolerances. She had calculated this carefully. She had designed her deception to fit inside the margin of acceptable error. But on this festival day, Hari spoke to the inspector before he reached Padma's stall. He spoke quietly, standing beside his spice pots, and what he said was simple. When you check the grain merchant's scales, I would ask that you try something additional. Place your standard weight on one side, then switch the pans. Place the same weight on the other side. If the scale is true, the reading will be the same. If it is not, the difference will tell you everything. The inspector looked at Hari for a long moment. He was a thorough man, but a busy one, and the standard check had always been sufficient. Still, there was something in Hari's quiet certainty that gave him pause. You have reason to believe the scale is false? The inspector asked. I have reason to believe the balance point is not centered, Hari said. A simple test will prove or disprove this. It will take only a moment. The inspector nodded. He walked to Padma's stall with his leather case. Padma greeted him with her customary brisk warmth. She cleared space on her counter for the inspection. She was calm. She had done this before. The inspector placed his standard weight on the grain pan. The scale tipped, balanced, settled. The reading was within tolerance, as always. Then the inspector did something he had never done before. He removed the weight, reversed the pans on their hooks, and placed the same weight on what had been the counterweight side. The scale settled. The reading was different. Not by much, but enough. The discrepancy, when the pans were reversed, doubled. What had been hidden within the margin of tolerance was now exposed by the simple act of switching sides. The inspector looked at the reading. He looked at Padma. The festival crowd, sensing something unusual, began to gather. The musicians played on, but nearer to the stall, a silence was forming, the way a silence forms around a truth that is about to be spoken. Your scale is false, the inspector said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence carried his words to every ear in the gathering crowd. Padma's face changed. The brisk confidence drained from it like water from a cracked vessel. Beneath it was something older and more complicated. Not surprise. She was not surprised. She had known this day might come. She had imagined it in the small hours of the night when sleep would not come and the scales seemed to weigh on her own chest. What showed on her face was something closer to relief. The terrible relief of a secret finally spoken. The exhaustion of a deception finally ended. But relief is a private feeling, and what was public was the crowd's reaction. The murmur began at the edges and moved inward like ripples in reverse. Merchants who had competed fairly with Padma for years felt their faces harden. Customers who had trusted her, who had brought their family's food money to her stall believing in the honesty of her scales, felt something drain from them. Not just anger, something deeper. The feeling of having been made a fool. The feeling of discovering that a hand you trusted had been taking from you all along, not with a fist, but with a gentle, practiced deception, so smooth you never felt it happen. Old Mira was in the crowd. She stood near the back, holding Chitra's hand, the child's fingers small and warm in her own rough palm. She heard the inspector's words. She watched Padma's face, and she understood, in a single, clear moment, why the rice ran short, why her granddaughter went to bed hungry every fourth night, why the bag never held as much as it should. She did not speak. She did not push forward or demand restitution. She simply stood there, a small old woman in a mended sari, holding the hand of a thin child, and the weight of her silent presence was heavier than anything Padma's false scales had ever measured. The magistrate imposed a fine. The scales were confiscated. Padma was permitted to continue her business only if she purchased new certified scales and submitted to monthly inspections for a period of 2 years. The financial penalty was significant, but not ruinous. But the true cost was not measured in coins. In the days that followed, Padma's stall grew quiet. Customers who had other options chose other merchants. Those who had no choice came to her stall with watchful eyes and careful hands, counting every grain, checking every measurement, treating each transaction as a negotiation with someone who could not be trusted. The easy warmth of commerce, the daily rhythm of greeting and exchange that had been the fabric of Padma's working life, was gone. In its place was a wariness that felt to Padma like a wall of glass. She could see her customers. She could speak to them, but she could not reach them. She had not stolen much from any single person. This was what she told herself in the dark hours. A handful of grain here, a few ounces there. No one had been greatly harmed. No one had died, as Gopal the well-digger had died. No one had been ruined, as Devesh had been ruined. She had merely trimmed the edges of honesty, shaved small slivers from each transaction, accumulated them into a comfort that she had convinced herself she deserved. But she had not thought about Mira. She had not thought about the families who counted their coins to the last copper piece and bought exactly what they needed and no more. She had not thought about children like Chitra, whose small stomachs measured the difference between honest and dishonest scales with a precision that no inspector could match. It was several weeks after the exposure that Padma saw Mira in the market. The old woman was buying rice from another merchant, counting coins from a small cloth purse with the slow deliberation of someone for whom each coin represented hours of work. Chitra stood beside her, holding the empty rice bag, waiting. Padma watched from her stall. She watched Mira's stiff fingers sort the coins. She watched Chitra's patient, quiet face. And she felt something that she had successfully avoided feeling for 5 years. She felt the weight of what she had done, not the abstract weight of dishonesty, not the philosophical weight of karma, the specific, concrete weight of a handful of rice that should have been in Mira's bag and was not. The weight of a child's hunger on a night when the rice ran out too soon. The weight of a grandmother's confusion as she measured and remeasured and could not understand why there was never quite enough. Padma closed her stall early that day. She went home and sat in her kitchen and looked at her hands. The same hands that had measured grain with such practiced grace. The same hands that had built a business, raised children, kept a household running. The same hands that had 5,000 times placed grain on a dishonest scale and swept it into bags and smiled and wished her customers well. She looked at her hands and she did not recognize them. The following morning, Padma went to Mira's house. It was a small house at the edge of the town, neatly kept despite its poverty. The walls were whitewashed. A single tree grew in the small courtyard, providing shade. Chitra was playing in the dust with a rag doll, talking to it in the serious, confidential voice that children use with their most trusted companions. Mira opened the door and saw Padma and said nothing. Her face was not hostile. It was not welcoming. It was simply still, the way a pond is still when the wind stops. "I came to apologize," Padma said. Mira waited. "My scales were false for 5 years. You bought rice from me and received less than you paid for. I do not know exactly how much I took from you, but I know that you and your granddaughter went hungry because of it." Mira still said nothing. In the courtyard, Chitra continued her conversation with the rag doll, unaware of the two women standing in the doorway. "I brought this," Padma said. She held out a cloth bag. Inside was rice. Good rice, more than Mira would buy in a month. Enough to fill the gap that 5 years of false scales had created, and more. Mira looked at the bag. She looked at Padma, and then she said something that Padma did not expect. "Do you know why I did not suspect you sooner?" Padma shook her head. "Because you were kind. You remembered my name. You asked after Chitra. You smiled when I came to your stall. And I thought, a woman who smiles like that, who remembers a child's name, would not steal from me. I trusted your kindness more than I trusted my own hands, which told me every time that the rice was light." She paused. Her old eyes were clear and unblinking. "That is the part that is hardest to forgive, not the rice. Rice can be replaced. You have brought rice, but the way you made me doubt myself, the way your smile made me think I was wrong when I was right, that I cannot weigh on any scale." Padma stood in the doorway with the bag of rice in her hands and felt the truth of these words settle into her like stones dropping into water. One by one, heavy, final. "I am sorry," she said again, and this time the words sounded different, thinner, less adequate, because she understood now that an apology, no matter how sincere, cannot undo the specific harm of making someone distrust their own perception. The rice could be returned, the trust could not. Mira took the bag. She thanked Padma. She did not invite her inside. She closed the door gently, without malice, but also without warmth, and Padma walked home through the market with empty hands and a full understanding of what her 5 years of false scales had truly cost. This story shows us the nature of dishonesty in commerce and its ripple effects on the most vulnerable. Padma discovered that small thefts, accumulated over time, create real suffering, and that the suffering falls hardest on those who can least absorb it. Buddhism teaches that right livelihood includes honesty in all our dealings, not merely as a moral abstraction, but as a practical recognition that our transactions are relationships. Every exchange is an act of trust. When we are dishonest, even in small ways, even in ways we believe are harmless, we do two things. We take what does not belong to us, and we damage the trust that makes community possible. Mira's loss was not merely rice. It was the confidence in her own judgment. It was the belief that kindness and honesty go together. It was the faith that a smile means what it appears to mean. And notice this: Padma's apology, though genuine, could not repair this damage fully. This is one of the most important teachings about harm. We often believe that remorse and restitution can undo what we have done. But some harms change the shape of a person's trust. They cannot be returned to their original form, any more than a crumpled cloth can be pressed perfectly smooth. The wrinkles remain, faint perhaps, but present. This is not a teaching about despair. It is a teaching about care. When we understand that some harms cannot be fully undone, we become more careful about causing them in the first place. We hold our scales with more honest hands. We weigh our actions before we act, knowing that the weight will be felt by others in ways we may never see. Let us rest here for a while. Your breath has found its own depth now. You may notice it has slowed. You may notice a warmth in your chest or a heaviness in your limbs. This is the body's wisdom. The body knows when it is safe to rest, and it is resting now. Allow it. Feel the darkness around you, if your eyes are closed. Not an empty darkness, a full one. A darkness that holds you the way a nest holds a sleeping bird. Soft, complete, warm. There is nothing you need to carry into sleep. These stories are doing their own work. They settle into you like rain into soil, finding the places where they are needed, nourishing what is ready to grow. You do not need to direct this. You do not need to understand it. Simply rest. Let us turn to one more story tonight. A story about a different kind of harm. Not the deliberate cruelty of Arjuna. Not the conscious fraud of Devesh. Not the unexamined habit of Suresh. Not the calculated dishonesty of Padma. Something else. Something that lives in the space between what we know and what we allow ourselves to see. In a coastal town where the sea was gray-green and restless, and the wind carried the smell of salt into every house and shop, there lived a magistrate named Kavi. He was a man of learning, educated in the capital, returned to his hometown to serve as its chief arbiter of justice. He had held this position for 11 years, and in that time, he had earned a reputation for fairness and precision. His judgments were careful. His reasoning was sound. He consulted the law thoroughly and applied it consistently. When merchants disputed contracts, Kavi read every clause and weighed every argument. When neighbors quarreled over boundaries, Kavi measured the land himself, walking the disputed lines with a surveyor's chain and a patience that impressed even the most aggrieved parties. He was, by all accounts, a just man, and this was the problem. For Kavi's justice had a quality that troubled those who observed it closely. It was technically perfect, but humanly incomplete. He applied the law with the precision of a craftsman, fitting joints in wood, each piece exactly aligned, every connection flush and true. But his judgments, for all their accuracy, sometimes left the people they were meant to serve feeling unseen, as if the law had spoken but had not listened. There was a fisherman in the town named Bimal. He was a man of 50, weathered by years of sun and salt, with hands that were permanently curved from gripping nets and oars. Bimal had fished the waters off the coast for his entire adult life, as his father had done, and his father before him. He knew the tides and the currents and the movements of fish with an intimacy that no chart or book could teach. The sea was his livelihood, his identity, the element in which his life made sense. Bimal had a dispute with a boat builder named Sanjay. The matter was this: Bimal had commissioned a new fishing boat. He had paid half the price in advance, as was customary, and Sanjay had agreed to deliver the boat within 3 months. The agreement was verbal, witnessed by 2 men in the tea shop where such arrangements were traditionally made. 3 months passed. The boat was not finished. Sanjay had encountered difficulties. The wood he had ordered was delayed by storms. His apprentice had fallen ill. His workshop had flooded during an unusually high tide. Each delay was real. Each excuse was genuine. But the cumulative effect was that Bimal's boat was not ready, and the fishing season was beginning. And every day without a boat was a day without income. Bimal went to Sanjay and asked for his money back so that he could commission a boat from another builder. Sanjay refused. The money had already been spent on materials. The wood, though delayed, had arrived and was being shaped. The boat was half built. To return the money would ruin Sanjay. Bimal went to Kavi. Kavi listened to both men with his customary attention. He examined the facts. The agreement was verbal, which was standard practice but offered no written terms to adjudicate. The witnesses confirmed the 3-month deadline, but could not agree on whether this was a firm commitment or an estimate. The wood had indeed been delayed. The apprentice had indeed been ill. The workshop had indeed flooded. Kavi applied the law. The law stated that in the absence of written terms, verbal agreements were binding, but subject to reasonable modification due to circumstances beyond the contractor's control. Storms, illness, and flooding qualified as such circumstances. Therefore, Sanjay was entitled to additional time and was not required to return the advance payment, provided he completed the boat within a revised time frame that Kavi would determine. Kavi set the new deadline at 6 weeks. He explained his reasoning. He cited the relevant precedents. His judgment was legally sound, carefully reasoned, and precisely articulated. And it failed Bimal completely, because what Kavi had not considered, what his careful legal reasoning had not accommodated, was this. Bimal could not wait 6 weeks. The fishing season lasted only 4 months. Every week of that season was critical. Bimal had no other source of income. He had a wife and 3 children. His savings, already depleted by the advance payment for the boat, would not last 6 weeks. Without a boat, without the ability to fish, Bimal's family would begin to go hungry within 2 weeks. Bimal tried to explain this. He stood before Kavi in the magistrate's chamber, turning his curved fisherman's hands over and over as if they were the evidence he could not put into words, and he said, "Sir, the law may give him 6 weeks, but my children cannot eat the law." Kavi heard this. He noted it, and he set it aside. "The law must be applied consistently," he said. "If I make exceptions based on individual hardship, the law becomes arbitrary. I understand your difficulty, Bimal, but the precedent is clear. Sanjay is entitled to the additional time." Bimal left the magistrate's chamber and walked down to the harbor. The tide was out. The boats of other fishermen sat on the exposed sand, their hulls dark with tar, their nets draped over the gunwales to dry. Gulls circled above them, calling in their sharp, insistent voices. The smell of the sea was everywhere, that mix of salt and weed and the cold mineral scent of deep water. Bimal stood among the boats that were not his and looked out at the gray-green water and felt something he had never felt before. He felt invisible, not unseen in the ordinary way, the way a person in a crowd is unseen, invisible in a deeper way, as if the thing that made him who he was, his work, his skill, his place in the life of the town, had been erased by a judgment that was perfectly correct and perfectly blind. He had been seen by the law. His case had been heard. Every fact had been weighed. And yet the most important fact of all, that his family would go hungry, had been weighed and found to be, in the law's careful estimation, beside the point. Bimal did not go home immediately. He sat on an overturned dinghy at the water's edge and watched the tide begin to turn. The water crept in slowly, covering the dark sand in thin, spreading sheets that caught the light. Small crabs scuttled ahead of the advancing water. Shells that had been dry and dull began to gleam as the sea reclaimed them. He thought about Kavi. He did not hate the magistrate. That was the strange thing. He could see that Kavi was trying to be fair. He could see the careful reasoning, the commitment to consistency, the desire to apply the law without favoritism. These were admirable qualities. In another circumstance, Bimal might have been grateful for them. But fairness that does not see suffering is not yet complete. Justice that measures everything except the weight of a family's hunger is not yet whole. And a law that protects process while ignoring consequence is a law that has lost its connection to the people it exists to serve. Bimal went home. He told his wife Mira about the judgment. She listened with the still attention of a woman who has learned to absorb bad news without letting it knock her over. When he finished, she said, "Then we will manage." "How?" "I will take in washing. You will mend nets for the other fishermen. We will eat less. The children will understand." She said this with a calm that was not resignation. It was something fiercer and more practical. The determination of a woman who has decided that her family will survive and who will dismantle the problem into pieces small enough to carry, one by one, through the days ahead. Bimal mended nets. It was work he could do with his eyes closed, his curved hands moving through the familiar motions of threading and knotting, closing the gaps where the mesh had torn. But mending another man's nets while your own boat sits unfinished in a builder's yard is a particular kind of humiliation. It is the humiliation of skill without means, of knowing how to do a thing and being unable to do it. Every knot he tied in someone else's net was a reminder of the knots he should have been tying in his own. Mira took in washing. She rose before dawn and walked to the houses of wealthier families and collected their soiled clothes in a large basket that she balanced on her head. She washed them in the river that fed into the harbor, kneeling on the stones, her hands red and raw in the cold water. She dried them on the flat rocks that lined the riverbank. She folded them with the same care she folded her own family's clothes, though her own family's clothes were fewer now. She had sold 2 of her saris to buy rice. The children did understand. Children understand more than we give them credit for, and they understand it earlier. Bimal's oldest son, who was 12, began working at the fish market, carrying baskets for the merchants in exchange for the damaged fish that could not be sold. His daughter, who was 9, helped Mira with the washing. His youngest, a boy of 6, became quieter. He stopped asking for sweets at the market. He stopped asking for anything at all. He simply watched his parents with large, dark eyes and ate what was put before him without complaint. The family survived. This is important to say. They did not starve. They did not lose their home. The 6 weeks passed, and Sanjay, to his credit, delivered the boat on time. It was a good boat, solid, well made. Bimal took it out on the first morning after delivery, before dawn, when the harbor was still dark and the only light came from the oil lamps of other fishermen preparing their vessels. He felt the boat move under him, responsive and true, and for a moment, standing at the tiller with the salt wind on his face and the open water ahead, he felt whole again. But the fishing season was half gone. The best catches had been made in the early weeks when the schools were dense and close to shore. Now the fish had moved into deeper waters. Bimal worked longer hours for smaller catches. He came home exhausted each evening, smelling of fish and salt, and counted his earnings and knew that this season would not make up for the weeks he had lost. The deficit persisted, not as a crisis, as a quiet, grinding insufficiency. A little less each month than the family needed, a slow erosion that expressed itself not in dramatic shortages, but in small daily calculations. 1 less meal of fish per week, mending a shirt instead of replacing it, sending the youngest to school without the copybook he needed because the copybook cost what a half-day's washing earned. And all of it was legal. All of it was the consequence of a judgment that was, by every measure of the law, correct. Kavi did not know about the washing or the mending of nets, or the shirts not replaced, or the copybook not bought. He did not know because he did not ask. His jurisdiction ended with the judgment. Once the law had spoken, the matter was closed. The file was placed in the cabinet with the other resolved cases, its edges aligned, its pages numbered, its conclusions clear and final and perfectly documented. This was Kavi's harm, not cruelty, not dishonesty, not even negligence in the legal sense. His harm was the careful, consistent practice of a justice that refused to see beyond its own boundaries, a justice that weighed facts, but not lives, that measured precedent, but not hunger, that applied rules with precision and compassion with reluctance. Let us pause here. Your breath moves gently, in and out, like the tide Bimmel watched from the overturned dinghy. In and out. There is a rhythm to all things, a rhythm to breathing, to waves, to the beating of your heart. You do not create this rhythm. You rest within it. Let yourself rest within it now. Feel the surface beneath you, holding you completely. Feel the air around you, soft and still. You are carried by this moment the way a boat is carried by calm water. No effort, no steering, simply held. Kavi became aware of his blindness through a conversation he did not expect. It happened on an evening when the autumn rains had begun and the streets of the town were running with water and the harbor was hidden behind curtains of gray mist. Kavi was walking home from his chambers, carrying an oil lamp against the early darkness, when he encountered an old monk sitting in the doorway of a shuttered shop. The monk was dry. The doorway was deep, sheltered by an overhanging roof that kept the rain at bay. He sat cross-legged on a folded cloth, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes half closed, as if the rain and the darkness and the cold were merely weather, things that happened outside the quiet space he carried within him. Kavi recognized the monk. His name was Sumedha, and he had lived in the town's small monastery for many years. He was known for his silence more than his speech, for his walks through the town at odd hours, for the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a road and stood perfectly still, watching something that no one else could see. Some people thought him eccentric. Others thought him wise. Most had stopped thinking about him at all, the way one stops thinking about a tree that has stood in the same place for so long, it has become part of the landscape. "You are out late, Venerable," Kavi said, pausing under the overhang to shake the rain from his cloak. "As are you," Sumedha replied. "I was delayed by a case, a boundary dispute, complex. Boundary disputes always are. Boundaries themselves are simple. It is the people on either side of them who are complex." Kavi smiled. He liked the monk's way of speaking, direct, unadorned. He often wished the litigants in his court would speak with such clarity. "May I sit for a moment?" Kavi asked. "The rain is heavy." "The doorway belongs to no one tonight. Sit." They sat together in the sheltered space, watching the rain fall in silver lines through the lamplight. The sound of it was steady, enveloping, the kind of rain that seems to wash the air itself clean. Water ran in small rivers along the gutters. A dog crossed the street, shaking itself, and disappeared into an alley. "You are considered a fair magistrate," Sumedha said after a long silence. "I try to be. I have a question about fairness, if you would permit it." Kavi nodded. He was accustomed to questions. They were the raw material of his work. "When you make a judgment," Sumedha said, "do you consider only the facts of the case, or do you also consider the weight of the judgment on the people involved?" Kavi thought carefully before answering. He respected the question enough to give it genuine consideration rather than a reflexive reply. "I consider the facts and the law," he said. "The weight of the judgment on the individuals is, of course, noted, but it cannot be the primary consideration. If I adjust every judgment based on the personal circumstances of the parties, the law becomes inconsistent. What is fair for one must be fair for all." Sumedha nodded slowly. "This is a very logical position. "Thank you." It was not a compliment. Kavi looked at the monk. The old man's face was calm, his expression neither critical nor kind, simply present, the face of someone stating what he observed. "Tell me," Sumedha said, "you are familiar with the fisherman Bimal?" "I adjudicated his case, the matter of the boat builder, yes." "Do you know what happened to his family during the 6 weeks they waited?" Kavi was quiet. He did not know. He had not asked. His wife washed clothes for wealthy families. His 12-year-old son carried fish baskets in the market. His youngest child stopped asking for things. The family ate less. They sold clothing. They survived, but they survived the way a tree survives a drought, by pulling inward, by reducing, by losing leaves. They will not easily regrow. Kavi listened. The rain continued its steady fall. The lamp between them flickered in a draft. "Your judgment was legally correct," Sumedha continued. "The boat builder was entitled to additional time. The precedent supported your decision. No scholar of law would find fault with your reasoning. Then what is your criticism?" "It is not a criticism. It is an observation. Your judgment was correct, but it was not complete." "What do you mean?" "You weighed the contract. You weighed the precedent. You weighed the circumstances that delayed the builder. But did you weigh the hunger of a fisherman's children? Did you place it on your scales? Did you ask what 6 weeks without income would mean for a family with no savings?" Kavi felt something tighten in his chest. Not defensiveness exactly, something more uncomfortable. The feeling of a question that finds the exact point where certainty begins to crack. "The law cannot accommodate every individual hardship," Kavi said. "If I had ruled in Bimal's favor because his children would go hungry, what would I say to the next boat builder whose client demands his money back? The precedent would be destroyed." "Perhaps," Sumedha said. "Or perhaps the precedent would be enriched." He turned to face Kavi more directly. The lamplight caught the lines of his face, deep grooves carved by years of weather and attention. "Let me ask you this, Kavi. What is the purpose of law?" "To maintain order, to resolve disputes fairly, to protect the rights of all people equally." "To protect the rights of all people," Sumedha repeated. "Does a child's right to eat fall outside this protection?" "It is not a legal right in the context of a commercial dispute. No, it is not a legal right. It is simply a human one." They sat in silence for a long time. The rain softened. The sound of it changed from a steady roar to a gentle patter, and then to individual drops falling from the edge of the overhang, each one a small, clear note. "I am not suggesting you should have ruled differently," Sumedha said at last. "Perhaps the law required exactly the judgment you gave. But within that judgment, were there no other possibilities? Could you have ordered Sanjay to pay Bimal a portion of the advance to sustain his family during the waiting period? Could you have shortened the extension from 6 weeks to 3? Could you have required Sanjay to provide Bimal with temporary use of another vessel? The law gives you discretion, Kavi. You chose not to use it." Kavi opened his mouth to respond and then closed it. Because the monk was right. The law did give him discretion. It gave him considerable latitude in the remedies he could impose. He had chosen the most straightforward remedy, the most precedent-consistent remedy, the remedy that required the least imagination. And in doing so, he had allowed a family to bear the full cost of a problem they had not created. "You are a good magistrate," Sumedha said. "Your judgments are fair, but fairness without compassion is like a bell without resonance. It makes the right shape, but not the right sound." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, slower, almost as if he were speaking to himself. The Buddha taught that wisdom and compassion are like two wings of a bird. A bird cannot fly with one wing alone. It may have the strongest wing in all the sky, perfectly feathered, capable of great power. But with only one wing, it circles. It never rises. It never arrives. Kavi sat with this image. He thought of himself as a bird with one powerful wing, circling and circling above the town, seeing everything clearly, understanding every dispute, every boundary, every clause, but never quite arriving at the place where justice and mercy meet. "I did not think of Bimal's children," Kavi said quietly. "No, I should have. Yes. The law did not require me to. No, the law did not. Compassion did." The rain had stopped. The street gleamed in the lamplight, wet and clean. The air smelled of rain on warm stone, that particular scent that comes when the earth receives water after a long, dry spell. "What would you have me do now?" Kavi asked. "Now is a different question than then," Sumedha said. "Then you could have shaped your judgment to hold both fairness and kindness. Now the judgment is past. The 6 weeks have been endured. The cost has been paid. Then there is nothing to be done. There is always something to be done. You cannot undo the hunger, but you can change the way you see. You can carry Bimal's children into your next judgment, and the one after that, and every one that follows, not as a legal precedent, but as a human memory. A reminder that every case that comes before you is not merely a set of facts. It is a life, many lives, lives that extend beyond the edges of the document, beyond the boundaries of the dispute, into kitchens and bedrooms and the quiet hours of the night when a mother counts her coins and a child learns to stop asking. Sumedha rose. He folded his cloth with the unhurried precision of a man for whom no action was too small for attention. He tucked it under his arm and stepped out into the wet street. "Goodness alone is not enough, Kavi," he said, turning back. "Goodness must be accompanied by seeing. A good man who does not see the consequences of his actions is like a man who walks carefully on a path. While others fall from the edges, he does not notice." He bowed slightly and walked away into the darkness, his bare feet making no sound on the wet stone. Kavi sat in the doorway for a long time after the monk had gone. The lamp burned low. The street was empty. The sounds of the town at night rose around him, familiar sounds he had heard 10,000 times. A dog barking, a door closing, the distant murmur of the sea against the harbor wall. He thought about Bimal's children. He thought about the youngest boy, the one who had stopped asking for things. He did not know this child. He had never seen him, but the image the monk had placed in his mind was vivid and specific. A 6-year-old boy with large, dark eyes who had learned through the machinery of a perfectly legal judgment that asking was futile. Kavi felt the image settle into him, not as guilt exactly, as awareness. The awareness that his power as a magistrate extended far beyond the words of his judgments, into the daily lives of people whose names he might never learn. The awareness that every decision he made, no matter how carefully reasoned, landed somewhere in the world and changed the shape of someone's day, someone's week, someone's understanding of whether the world was a place that saw them or a place that looked through them. He went home. He ate dinner with his wife. He sat at his desk afterward and opened the file of his next case. It was a dispute between a landlord and a tenant. The facts were clear. The law was straightforward. The judgment all but wrote itself. But Kavi did not write it. Not yet. He sat with the file open and asked himself a question he had never asked before. Who else is in this room? Not the landlord, not the tenant, not the witnesses or the precedents or the relevant statutes. Who else? Whose life extended beyond the edges of this document? Whose hunger, whose fear, whose hope, whose child, whose sleep would be affected by the words he was about to write? He did not have answers. Not for this case, not yet. But the question itself changed something. It opened a door in his careful, precise, legally impeccable mind, and through that door came a draft of something warmer than logic, something that smelled like rain on stone and sounded like a child's voice, not asking. He picked up his pen. He began to write. But he wrote differently now, not less carefully, not less precisely, but with an awareness that the law was not the only thing in the room, that people were in the room too, people with bodies that grew hungry and hearts that grew heavy and children who watched everything and learned. This story shows us the harm of justice without compassion. Kavi discovered that correctness alone is not enough, that a judgment can be legally perfect and humanly incomplete. Buddhism teaches that wisdom, prajna, and compassion, karuna, must always walk together. One without the other is incomplete. Wisdom without compassion becomes cold precision. Compassion without wisdom becomes sentimental chaos. Together, they form the foundation of a life that truly serves. When we are in positions of authority, when our decisions affect the lives of others, we carry a responsibility that extends beyond the technical requirements of our role. The teacher who follows the curriculum without seeing the struggling student. The doctor who treats the disease without seeing the frightened person. The manager who follows policy without seeing the employee's circumstances. All of these are variations of Kavi's blindness, the blindness of competence without connection. Bimal's youngest son, the boy who stopped asking, is perhaps the most important character in this story. He is the one who bears the cost of a justice that could not see beyond its own framework. He is the reminder that our actions, especially those made from positions of power, have consequences that travel far beyond our sight, into the lives of people we may never meet, into the hearts of children who are always, always watching. Let your body settle more deeply now. Feel the heaviness in your limbs growing. Feel the warmth spreading through you, from your chest outward, into your arms, your hands, your fingers, into your legs, your feet, your toes. A gentle, spreading warmth, like sunlight moving slowly across a field. Your eyelids are heavy. Let them be heavy. They have worked all day, seeing, scanning, reading, watching. They deserve to rest. Give them permission. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and feel the relief of not needing to see, not needing to watch, not needing to read the world or interpret its signals, simply being here, in the dark, in the quiet, in the warmth. There is one more story I would like to share with you tonight. It is the quietest of all the stories we have heard, the gentlest, and perhaps, in its gentleness, the most important. In a small monastery tucked into the fold of two hills, where a stream ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and the air always smelled of pine, there lived a community of monks. They were not many, 12, sometimes 15, depending on the season and the wanderings of those whose practice took them onto the roads. They lived simply. They meditated at dawn and dusk. They tended a garden that provided most of their food. They mended their own robes and swept their own floors and carried water from the stream in clay jars balanced on their shoulders. Among them was a monk named Tenzin. He had come to the monastery 20 years ago as a young man of 19, driven by a grief he could not name, and a restlessness that nothing in the world of work and family had been able to quiet. He had shaved his head, taken his vows, and given himself to the practice with a sincerity that impressed even the most senior monks. 20 years. 20 years of rising before dawn. 20 years of sitting in meditation, watching his breath, watching his mind, watching the endless parade of thoughts and feelings and sensations that moved through him like weather through a valley. 20 years of carrying water and sweeping floors and pulling weeds from the garden. 20 years of silence, broken only by the chanting of sutras and the occasional necessary words of daily coordination. In those 20 years, Tenzin had become deeply skilled in meditation. He could sit for hours without moving. His concentration was sharp and steady, like a flame in a room without wind. He could observe his thoughts without being carried away by them. He could watch anger arise and pass without acting on it. He could watch desire arise and pass without pursuing it. His mind had become, through years of patient training, a clear and quiet space. And yet, there was a monk in the monastery named Pima. He was younger than Tenzin by several years, a round-faced man with a tendency to hum while he worked, and a habit of asking questions during teachings that the other monks found either refreshing or irritating, depending on their mood. Pima was not as advanced in meditation as Tenzin. His concentration wavered. His posture was imperfect. He sometimes fell asleep during evening meditation, his chin dropping to his chest, his breathing deepening into the unmistakable rhythm of sleep. And Tenzin could not stand him. This is not quite accurate. Tenzin could stand him in the way that one stands a persistent noise or an uncomfortable temperature. He endured Pima. He tolerated Pima. But beneath the tolerance, beneath the calm exterior that 20 years of practice had so carefully constructed, there lived a small, persistent irritation that Tenzin had never been able to dissolve. It expressed itself in small ways: a tightening of the jaw when Pima hummed, a slight withdrawal when Pima sat next to him at meals, a flicker of something, too quick to be called contempt, but too sharp to be called indifference, when Pema asked one of his questions during teaching. Tenzin was aware of this irritation. He was a skilled meditator. He could see it arise in his mind with perfect clarity. He could observe it, label it, note it, and set it aside. He had been doing this for years, noting the irritation, labeling it, setting it aside, returning to his breath, returning to the clear, quiet space of his practiced mind. But the irritation did not go away. It returned. Every morning when Pema hummed in the kitchen, every evening when Pema's chin dropped during meditation, every teaching session when Pema's hand went up and his round face brightened with the particular eagerness of a man who has thought of something he considers interesting. The irritation returned, and Tenzin set it aside, and it returned, and he set it aside, and it returned. And after 20 years of this cycle, the irritation was no weaker than it had been on the first day. This troubled Tenzin. It troubled him because it suggested something about his practice that he did not want to examine. If 20 years of meditation could not dissolve a simple irritation with a fellow monk, what had 20 years of meditation actually accomplished? He brought this question reluctantly to the abbot. The abbot was an old man named Dorje, who had lived in the monastery for 40 years and who spoke so rarely that his words, when they came, had the quality of stones dropped into still water. They sank in and sent ripples outward for a long time. Tenzin sat before the abbot in the small interview room where monks brought their practice questions. The room was bare. A cushion for the abbot, a cushion for the student, a window through which the sound of the stream entered like a guest who needed no invitation. I have a difficulty with one of the brothers, Tenzin said. Dorje waited. Pima. He irritates me. His humming, his questions, I do not know how to say this, his ease, the way he moves through the practice without the seriousness it deserves. Dorje nodded. His old eyes were steady. And you have tried to work with this irritation in your practice? For 20 years. Tell me what you do when the irritation arises. I note it. I label it. I observe it without judgment. I return my attention to my breath. I let it pass. And it passes? Yes. In the moment, it passes. But it returns. Always. Dorje was quiet for a long time. The stream spoke through the window. A bird called once, twice, and was silent. Tenzin, the abbot said, you have become very skilled at setting things aside. Yes, Tenzin said. He heard something in the abbot's tone that made him careful. Is that not what the practice teaches? To observe without attachment? To let thoughts and feelings arise and pass without clinging to them? It is part of what the practice teaches, Dorje said. An important part, but only a part. He shifted on his cushion. His old knees cracked softly, and he smiled at the sound the way one smiles at a familiar companion. Tell me, Tenzin, when you observe your irritation with Pima, when you note it and label it and set it aside, do you ever ask it what it wants? Tenzin blinked. Ask it what it wants? Yes, the irritation. It has been coming to you faithfully for 20 years. Every morning, every evening. It is perhaps the most reliable visitor you have. And in 20 years, you have never once invited it to sit down. You have never once asked it why it has come. You have simply noted it and shown it the door. Tenzin was quiet. The stream continued its gentle murmur. A cloud must have passed over the sun, because the light in the room softened and the shadows on the wall shifted. I thought that was the practice, Tenzin said. To not engage with the content of thoughts and feelings, to observe them from a distance, to maintain equanimity. Equanimity, Dorje said, tasting the word as if it were a piece of fruit he was checking for ripeness. Yes, equanimity is essential. But equanimity is not the same as avoidance, and observation is not the same as understanding. He leaned forward slightly. You can observe a bird from a great distance. You can note its color, its size, its direction of flight. You can label it, but you cannot know the bird from a distance. To know the bird, you must come closer. You must watch it build its nest. You must see how it feeds its young. You must hear the particular quality of its song when it is calling for a mate and when it is warning of danger. Your irritation with Pima is a bird that has been singing outside your window for 20 years, and you have spent 20 years noting its song without ever once opening the window to see what it needs. Tenzin sat with this. He sat with it the way he sat with everything, carefully, with the trained stillness of 2 decades of practice. But something was different this time. The stillness itself felt different, less like a shield and more like a question. What do I do? He asked. The next time the irritation arises, Dorje said, do not set it aside. Sit with it, not from a distance, not as an observer watching weather pass. Sit with it the way you would sit with a friend who has come to tell you something important. Let it speak. Listen to what it says. You may be surprised. Tenzin bowed and left the interview room. He walked along the path that led from the abbot's quarters to the garden, a path of smooth stones set into the earth, worn concave by 40 years of monks' feet. The stream ran alongside, its sound constant, its surface catching light in small, shifting patterns. He walked slowly, not from attention this time, but from uncertainty. For the first time in 20 years, He did not know what his practice required of him. The tools he had relied upon, the noting, the labeling, the observing, the setting aside, had been gently, firmly called into question, not dismissed, not discredited, but revealed as incomplete. That evening, in the meditation hall, Tenzin took his usual seat. The hall was simple: wooden floor, worn smooth, cushions arranged in 2 rows facing each other. A single candle at the front, its flame barely moving in the still air. The smell of incense, faint now, the stick having burned down hours ago, leaving only a ghost of fragrance. The monks settled, the bell was struck. Silence gathered, thick and warm, filling the hall like water filling a bowl. Pema sat across from Tenzin. His posture was, as always, slightly imperfect. His shoulders were not quite level. His hands rested in his lap with a looseness that Tenzin had always read as carelessness. His eyes closed, and within minutes, the subtle shift in his breathing announced what Tenzin knew was coming. The deepening, the slowing, the gentle collapse of consciousness into sleep. Pema's chin began its familiar descent toward his chest, and the irritation arose, right on time, faithful as the stream, familiar as the sound of the bell. But this time, Tenzin did not note it. He did not label it. He did not observe it from the practiced distance of 20 years of equanimity. Instead, he turned toward it. He opened the window, as the abbot had said. He sat with the irritation the way one sits with a friend who has traveled a long way to deliver a message. And the irritation, thus invited, began to speak. It did not speak in words. It spoke in images, in feelings, in the body's own language. Tenzin felt a tightness in his throat, a heat behind his eyes, a pressure in his chest that was not anger, not frustration, but something older and more tender. He saw Pema's face, the round, open face, the ease, the way Pema moved through the monastery as if the practice were a warm bath rather than the rigorous discipline Tenzin understood it to be, the way Pema hummed, the way he asked questions without fear of appearing foolish, the way he fell asleep in meditation without shame, without self-punishment, without the grinding self-criticism that Tenzin carried like a stone in his chest. And Tenzin saw, with a clarity that made him catch his breath, what the irritation had been trying to tell him for 20 years. He was not irritated by Pema's carelessness. He was grieving his own inability to be careless. He was not angered by Pema's ease. He was aching for an ease he had never permitted himself. He was not frustrated by Pema's imperfect posture, his wandering attention, his cheerful refusal to take things as seriously as Tenzin thought they should be taken. He was heartbroken by his own rigidity, his own relentless, unyielding demand that everything, including himself, be perfect. Pema was not the problem. Pema was the mirror. Every time Pema hummed, Tenzin heard the song he had silenced in himself. Every time Pema asked a foolish question, Tenzin felt the questions he had swallowed for fear of appearing inadequate. Every time Pema fell asleep in meditation, Tenzin felt the exhaustion he had never allowed himself to acknowledge, the bone-deep tiredness of a man who had been holding himself at attention for 20 years without rest. The irritation was not irritation at all. It was longing. It was the longing of a clenched fist to open, the longing of a held breath to release, the longing of a man who had spent so long building the walls of his practice that he had forgotten there was supposed to be a door. Tenzin sat in the meditation hall and felt something break open in his chest. Not dramatically, not with the force of a dam giving way, more like ice melting in spring, slowly, gently, the warmth spreading outward from a center that had been frozen for a very long time. He opened his eyes. Across the hall, Pima had woken from his brief sleep and was sitting quietly, his round face peaceful, his breathing steady. He caught Tenzin's gaze and smiled, a small, unself-conscious smile, the smile of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. And Tenzin, for the first time in 20 years, smiled back. It was not a large moment. No one else in the hall noticed it. The candle continued to burn. The silence continued to hold. The stream outside continued its quiet conversation with the stones. But something had changed in the space between two monks sitting across from each other in a wooden hall, and the change was as real as any judgment or any rope or any scale. The next morning, Tenzin rose before dawn, as always. He washed his face with cold water from the stream, as always. He walked to the kitchen to begin preparing rice for the morning meal, as always. Pema was already there, humming. Tenzin felt the familiar tightening begin, the jaw, the shoulders, the slight withdrawal. But this time, he recognized it, not as an enemy to be defeated, not as a visitor to be shown the door, as a messenger, a faithful messenger who had been trying to deliver the same message for 20 years and had finally been heard. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to Pema hum. The tune was simple, aimless, the kind of melody that has no beginning and no end, that exists purely for the pleasure of making sound. It was, Tenzin realized, beautiful. Not in the way a trained musician's performance is beautiful. Beautiful the way birdsong is beautiful. Unself-conscious. Free. Tenzin began to prepare the rice, and as he washed the grains, running his fingers through the cool water, feeling the smooth, round shapes move between his hands, he began very quietly, almost inaudibly, to hum. Pema looked up. His eyebrows rose slightly. He said nothing. He simply smiled that round, open smile and continued his own humming, and the two melodies, neither of them proper tunes, wove together in the early morning air of the kitchen, and the sound was imperfect and unremarkable and completely, entirely sufficient. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Tenzin's practice. His meditation did not become less disciplined. His concentration did not waver. But the quality of his sitting changed. It became softer, less like a soldier standing guard and more like a man sitting by a fire. The alertness was still there. The attention was still there. But the rigidity was dissolving slowly, like salt in warm water. He began to notice things he had not noticed before. The way the light changed in the meditation hall as the sun moved across the sky, painting the wooden walls in shades of gold and amber. The way the other monks breathed, each one with his own rhythm, his own depth, creating a gentle chorus of inhalation and exhalation that filled the hall like a tide. The way the incense smoke moved in the still air, curling and twisting in patterns of such delicacy that they seemed intentional, as if the smoke were writing something in a language only the air could read. He noticed Pema, not with irritation, with something closer to gratitude. Pema, who had been his unwitting teacher for 20 years. Pema, whose imperfection had held up a mirror to Tenzin's impossible standards, and waited, patiently, humming, for Tenzin to see what was reflected there. One afternoon, Tenzin found Pema in the garden, pulling weeds with the absent-minded thoroughness of a man whose hands know their work and whose mind is elsewhere. Tenzin knelt beside him and began to pull weeds as well. They worked in silence for a while, their hands moving through the dark earth, the smell of soil and green things rising around them. "Pema," Tenzin said. "Yes? I owe you an apology." Pema looked up. His face was open, curious, without a trace of defensiveness. For what? For 20 years of not seeing you clearly. I have treated you unkindly. Not in large ways, in small ways. A tightening when you sat near me. A withdrawal when you spoke. A judgment I carried about your practice that I now understand was a judgment about my own. Pema was quiet for a moment. He pulled a weed, shook the soil from its roots, and set it aside. I know, he said. Tenzin looked at him. I have always known, Pema said. It is difficult to miss when someone tightens every time you enter a room. He smiled, not with hurt, not with accusation, with the same uncomplicated warmth he brought to everything. But I did not take it personally. I could see that your difficulty was not with me. It was with something in yourself. You could see this? You are a man who holds himself very tightly, Tenzin, like a rope wound too many times. Anyone can see it. The other monks see it. The abbot certainly sees it. You are the only one who could not see it, because you were too busy maintaining the tension to notice it was there. Tenzin sat back on his heels. The garden stretched around them, neat rows of vegetables, the green of their leaves vivid against the dark soil. A bee moved from flower to flower along the border, unhurried, thorough, utterly absorbed in its work. I wasted 20 years, Tenzin said. No, Pema said, and his voice, for all its usual lightness, carried something deeper now, something steady and sure. You did not waste them. You built the foundation, the concentration, the discipline, the ability to observe your own mind. These are real accomplishments, Tenzin. You simply forgot to build the rest of the house. He paused, pulling another weed, and then added, with a gentleness that Tenzin felt like warm water on cold hands. The house needs walls and a roof, yes, but it also needs windows and a door that opens. Tenzin felt the truth of this settle into him. 20 years of practice, and the deepest teaching had come not from the sutras, not from the meditation cushion, not from the abbot's carefully placed words, but from a round-faced monk who hummed in the kitchen and fell asleep during evening meditation and asked foolish questions without shame. This story shows us the subtle harm of spiritual rigidity, the harm we do to ourselves when we turn practice into performance and discipline into denial. Tenzin discovered that his irritation with Pema was not a flaw in his practice, but a message from the part of himself he had locked away. Buddhism teaches that meditation is not about achieving a state of perfect control. It is about seeing clearly. And what Tenzin had been refusing to see for 20 years was his own need for gentleness. When we practice harshly, when we demand perfection of ourselves, when we judge others for the ease we cannot allow in ourselves, we create a particular kind of suffering. It is the suffering of a person who is doing everything right and wondering why they do not feel free. The answer, as Tenzin discovered, is that freedom does not come from doing things right. It comes from seeing clearly. And seeing clearly sometimes means turning toward the very thing we have been most diligently avoiding. Pema's gift to Tenzin was not a teaching. It was a mirror. And the greatest spiritual courage is not the courage to sit still for hours or to master the mind's restlessness. It is the courage to look into the mirror and let ourselves be changed by what we see. Let us rest here now. Let all these stories settle. We have traveled far together tonight. We have met Arjun, who tied death into rope and found the noose on his own neck. We have met Devesh, who wore holiness as a costume and was buried with it. We have sat with Suresh, who taught his son the lesson of separation without ever saying a word. We have stood before Padma's scales and felt the weight of a theft too small to see, but too real to ignore. We have walked with Bimal to the empty harbor and felt the blindness of a justice that could not see hunger. And we have sat with Tenzin in the meditation hall as he finally opened the window to the bird that had been singing for 20 years. Each of these stories reveals a different face of harm, the deliberate and the accidental, the visible and the invisible, the harm we do to others and the harm we do to ourselves. They are different in their details but united in their teaching. Every action ripples, every choice echoes. Every moment of seeing or refusing to see shapes the world in ways we cannot fully predict. But these stories are not meant to burden you. They are not meant to fill you with worry about the consequences of your actions. They are meant to invite awareness, gentle awareness. The awareness that comes not from fear, but from care. The awareness of a person who understands that they are part of a web of connection so intricate and so vast that every thread matters. And notice this. In every story, there was a moment of seeing. Suresh lowered his hands. Padma closed her stall. Kavi opened his file with new eyes. Tenzin smiled at Pema. These moments of seeing did not undo the harm that had been done, but they changed the direction of the river. They opened a door that had been closed. They allowed something new to begin. This is the deepest teaching of all. We cannot undo the past. We cannot unsay the words or untie the knots or refill the scales. But we can see. We can see clearly, right now, in this moment. And from that seeing, a different future can grow. You do not need to hold any of this. Let it rest in you the way rain rests in the earth, quietly, deeply, nourishing what it finds. Now, let your body soften completely. Begin with your feet. Feel them resting. Feel the muscles of your toes release. Feel your arches soften, your ankles, your calves, those muscles that carry you through the day. Let them be still now. Let them rest. Your knees, your thighs, heavy and warm, sinking into the surface beneath you. The surface holds you. It has always held you. You do not need to hold yourself, your hips, your lower back, places where tension gathers without our knowing. Let it drain away now, like water finding the lowest point. Let it flow out of you and into the earth, which can hold anything. Your belly, soft, rising and falling with your breath. No need to hold it tight. No need to protect it. Simply let it move with the breath, gently, like a boat rocking on calm water. Your chest, your heart, still beating, still faithful after all these years. It asks nothing of you tonight. It does its work without instruction. Trust it. Let it carry you. Your shoulders, let them fall, further than you think. There, feel how much you were holding. Feel how good it is to set it down. Your neck, your jaw, the muscles of your face, your forehead, smooth, open, empty of effort. Your eyes closed now, resting behind their lids like birds in a nest, safe, still, warm. You are held. You are safe. The night is around you like a soft cloth, and the silence is not empty, but full of rest, full of peace, full of the simple, ordinary miracle of being alive and being still. There is nothing you need to do now. There is nothing you need to understand. There is nothing you need to become. You are already complete. You have always been complete. The stories are settling into you, finding their place, and you do not need to direct them. They will do their work in the quiet hours, the way seeds do their work in the dark earth, unseen, unhurried, certain. Let your breath carry you now, each inhale a gentle wave, each exhale a letting go. The waves grow smaller, softer, slower. You are resting. You are safe. You are home. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us at Sleepy Monk.